Thank you so much for being here. I'm Nick Carnes. I'm a political scientist at Duke University. I'm really delighted to be at the John Locke Foundation today. I'm going to be talking about a question that I think evokes a pretty strong response from people. Should politicians get a pay raise? I would ask you to please hold your tomatoes until the end. So I want to start with House Bill 71. House Bill 71 was introduced in the North Carolina General Assembly back in February by a representative named Pat Hurley. Representative Hurley is from Randolph County, so Asheboro. And in a lot of ways, we could tell a story about this legislation that says it's very uncontroversial, it's almost boring. So the legislation was sponsored by a bipartisan coalition. The primary sponsors, including Representative Hurley, were 3 Republicans and 1 Democrat. The co-sponsors were 10 Republicans and 6 Democrats. 2 of those Democrats are whips, so they're people with standing within the party leadership. It's a bipartisan bill. It was introduced by a member who knows a thing or two about the importance of the compensation and reimbursement that politicians get. Representative Hurley lists her full-time occupation as a legislator, which means she doesn't have an outside job where she's earning income. And according to Google Maps, her district is a 3-hour round trip from Raleigh, which if you think about gas prices, is not a trivial drive if you want to visit your constituents or you want to visit the General Assembly. And that's 3 hours if there's not construction, so that could go up and up. This is not sort of an issue that came out of the blue either. Representative Hurley didn't just wake up one day and say, gosh, I need a pay raise. 2 years ago, the North Carolina General Assembly formed a committee to study the issue, solicited input from the National Conference of State Legislatures, and it turns out that politicians in North Carolina are compensated at a much lower rate than politicians in other states. So this is the annual salaries paid to politicians in all the 42 states that pay an annual salary to members of their legislatures. And here's North Carolina here. And for reference, I've just put our neighbors to the north right there. North Carolina is on the low end in terms of the base salary that we pay the typical member of our General Assembly. But the thing you have to understand about compensating state legislators is that there's more to it than the base salary. In fact, a lot more. There are 2 other major categories of compensation that state legislators get beyond the salary they're paid for the work. One is a food and lodging per diem. So 47 states have a per diem. North Carolina's tends to be on the low side. Here's Virginia up here at the top. And the other major category of reimbursement for state legislators is mileage. And the basic logic is we don't want a member who lives in the western part of the state and has to drive not just 3 hours, but 6 or more. That we want to make sure that everyone's just compensated for whatever kind of mileage they have to drive. And North Carolina is actually second to last on that. Most states pay 54 cents a mile, which was the IRS standard for reimbursing your employees 2 years ago. North Carolina pays 29 cents, which was the IRS standard for reimbursing employees in 1993. So this is where things stand. So you could tell one story that says, well, Representative Hurley introduced this bill, and it has some really interesting features. It doesn't take effect until 2019. So anyone who's in office today, if their constituents don't like that they voted for this bill, they won't ever see a dime under this legislation. It doesn't take an effect until after the next General Assembly election. And what it does isn't terribly exotic. It doesn't increase the salary for politicians. That 13,000 figure stays the same. What it does is it reimburses members for their weekly travel to and from Raleigh at the 2015 IRS rate rather than the 1993 rate. It reimburses them for their meals and lodging in Raleigh at the 2017 federal employee rate rather than the 1993 rate, or it pays them a flat $51 a day. So if you don't want to save all your receipts for meals, you get a flat $51 a day, and your lodging is just the 2016 Department of Defense federal employee rate. So going from $26 a day and the 1993 rate to $51 a day and the 2016 rate. So we could tell one version of this legislative history that says, this isn't a terribly exciting, this isn't reinventing North Carolina government. This is more like routine maintenance. It's been more than 20 years since we've looked at how we compensate members. We're not going to change their salaries, but we are going to make sure that their travel and lodging and meals are reimbursed. That's one story we could tell about Representative Hurley's bill. Another story we could tell is something more like this. North Carolina legislators want to pay themselves more. Now, this is the headline that the News and Observer blog Under the Dome ran at about lunchtime on the day the bill was introduced. As you might expect, Facebook was very unkind to Representative Hurley and House Bill 71. People said things like, not just no, but hell no. They said, put it on the ballot and see what your bosses think. That's how it works in the real world. I don't get to set my own pay. They said, that's cute. These millionaires, I don't know if there actually are that many millionaires, but these millionaires are complaining about having to spend their own money on food and lodging. And then what a lot of people do when legislative pay comes up is they link it to some other issue. They say, instead of paying legislators more, let's pay teachers more. Let's raise the minimum wage for the state. And my favorite one of all, which was, and I'm not saying I endorse this view, but it's funny. If legislators are unhappy with their pay, Bojangles is hiring. I would like to point out that the salary you would earn working a year at Bojangles is actually higher than the base salary for a North Carolina General Assembly member. So this person wasn't just being colorful, they were being empirically correct also. And I haven't just cherry-picked the few critics, as you might imagine. You can take every single comment for hours and hours on this news story, and they're all negative. And North Carolina is not alone. In fact, in virtually every state, when legislative compensation comes up, people get mad. About 3 weeks ago, in Colorado, the state legislature there really needed to increase the compensation paid to county judges. It had fallen way behind. They were losing good judges. They said, we're going to raise the pay for county judges. But because of an old law in the books, in Colorado, every extra dollar you pay to a county judge, you also pay an extra 25 cents to the state legislators. In order to pass that bill, they first had to introduce a bill decoupling state legislator pay from county judge pay. And once that bill passed, then they had the votes on the county judge bill, which is what they really wanted to do. The most famous example of backlash along these lines is actually probably from 1989. In 1989, Nevada, which doesn't pay state lawmakers a salary at all, but it pays them a pension. And it used to be $25 for every year you're in the general or the state legislature in Nevada. Afterwards, you get a pension of $25 a year. And in 1989, the Nevada legislature voted to bump that up to $100. So for every year you're in the legislature, you get $100 in pension later on. So if you're in there for 10 years, you're looking at a $1,000 a month pension. This bill was so wildly unpopular that the state legislature convinced the governor to convene an emergency session of the legislature before the next election so that they could repeal the bill. And even then, many of the lawmakers who voted for the pension raise lost their seats, even after repealing it. The very fact that they would support it in the first place was enough for voters to give them the boot. The issue is so challenging for people who care about state legislatures that the National Conference of State Legislatures actually has a whole page on what they call the pay problem, where they point out that basically no one has figured out how to talk about the salaries we pay to state lawmakers without an eruption of public hostility on this issue. There's just no way to do this issue that doesn't make people really upset. To put it another way, pay raises for politicians always make bad politics. You don't want to be the politician pushing for a pay raise. The research question I'm interested in, though, goes back to the people who are calling for these pay raises, which is, does paying politicians more make for good government? Even though it's hard, even though people dislike it, is it something that we need to do? And so that's where I got interested in this topic. In the National Conference of State Legislatures website on what they call the pay problem, they list a lot of different benefits. They say, even though paying politicians is complicated from a political standpoint, from an election standpoint, it does a lot of good things. You want to compensate your legislators more. And what's really interesting is most of the benefits that the NCSL and other supporters of pay raises point to have to do with the economic backgrounds of politicians. They say that without adequate legislation, you won't have economic diversity among elected officials. You want the entire population adequately represented, regardless of age or wealth. You want everyone, rich or poor, to be able to afford to serve. And that got me really interested, because that's actually what I study primarily. So I do research on the economic or social class backgrounds of politicians, how that affects the choices they make in office. And so I said, that's a really interesting argument. Now, proponents of pay raises also point to benefits in terms of just general good government. They say, you know, policy's gotten so complex, the responsibilities of politicians have become so burdensome, we need to pay them more in order to, get them to focus on their jobs. But the vast majority of what you'll hear when you hear about pay raises in a typical, from a typical organization that advocates them really focuses on the economic diversity of politicians. If we don't pay enough, John Q. Public won't be able to afford to hold office and still pay the bills. And the end result will be that everyone who governs us is just a millionaire and a billionaire. And that's a bad thing. Now, what I'm going to tell you today is that if you look at the actual research, higher politicians' salaries are associated with some good things. They're associated with less outside employment and fewer missed roll call votes. There are more Representative Pat Hurleys in the mix, representatives who say, I'm not going to do a full-time job, I'm basically in the legislature year-round anyway, so I'm not going to bother trying to do a second job on top of that. They show up more often, they're in the State House more often. There are fewer politicians who are out of step with their constituents. They look more like their districts in states that pay more. And in terms of how they spend their time, they pay more attention to their constituents. And so, we think these are all probably good things for politicians to do. States that have higher politician salaries don't wind up spending more in other areas. So the fiscal discipline, by which I mean, taxes per capita or spending per capita, looks about the same. So having politicians paid more doesn't seem to change a lot of other things. But the piece that I was interested in the first place doesn't seem to be there. States that pay their politicians more don't have a more economically diverse legislature. It doesn't look more like the state. It looks like the legislatures everywhere else. It is understandable, I think, why the proponents of pay raises for politicians focus on diversity. That's their sort of their sales pitch. That's the line of attack. Because I can show you that politicians who are different behave differently. Right answer here is all the above. I just gave a final exam right before I drove over here, so I apologize. I'm in exam mode. But I can show you that controlling for party, controlling for their constituents, politicians who are female tend to have different views on gender equality issues. Politicians who are white and black tend to differ in how they think and how they vote, the kinds of bills they introduce on racial justice issues. That politicians who are believers tend to have different preferences on school vouchers for private religious schools, as opposed to politicians who are atheists. That politicians who are rich or who are veterans or who are young, that any characteristic that predicts differences in how regular Americans think about a given issue almost certainly predicts differences in how politicians think and often how they behave on that issue. And the underlying message there is really, politicians are people too. We have to remember that when we talk about politicians. We can be mad at them, we can hate the choices they make, but they are human beings and they bring their backgrounds and their experiences with them when they come to political office. John Boehner used to always say on the campaign trail, he used to say, I'm a small businessman, that's the approach I bring to government. I worked in business for years and now when I get into Washington, that's the perspective that informs my thinking. The research says John Boehner is exactly right. He's telling the truth. That politicians really bring their own backgrounds, their own experiences, their own ideas, because they're people too. And we all kind of know this from our own experience. If you've ever worked in group decision making, if you just imagine we were just going to have a focus group that would set state policy. So a focus group that's going to decide whether it should be harder to file a medical malpractice lawsuit in North Carolina. We all kind of know that who you get at the table to make that decision matters. So if I got a bunch of doctors from Duke to make that choice, the outcome would probably be pretty favorable to doctors. Medical malpractice lawsuits are too frivolous. If I went into the waiting room while the patients are sitting there and I rounded up a bunch of patients, or if I went to the office of the people who sue attorneys and I said, hey, will you come to my focus group? We'd probably get a different outcome than if we just let doctors make the decision. And what a lot of people think, and my own view, is that it's probably right not to leave anybody out when you make a choice like that. That the ideal focus group here would have people who represent doctors and the medical community, people who think about patients' needs, attorneys, hospitals, that you wouldn't want to make a choice like that, totally excluding somebody, leaving somebody out from the table. So it is understandable why people who want to push a reform talk about diversity or talk about the economic makeup of our political institutions. Because we all kind of know that who has a seat at the table matters when you make decisions that affect everybody. And so this is the argument you'll often hear. This was a piece I read back in January. Somebody sent this to me. On the morning commute, NPR ran a story that's basically just perfectly encapsulated the argument that you're going to hear about diversity and pay raises for politicians. And it goes like this. Holding office in the General Assembly takes a lot of time. We call it a part-time legislature, but in the long session, they're really there like a full-time job. And then even the last short session was, I think, 8 months long. So it is, a very time-consuming task. And as a result, the people who choose to do it have to give up or completely, they have to either cut back on their work in private sector, or they have to cut it out altogether. They have to quit their job, or they have to really scale back the work they do. And as a result, people who don't have a lot of money can't afford to be politicians. Because if you can't afford to make ends meet on the salary they're offering in Raleigh, you're not going to throw your hat into the ring in the first place. And as a result, only rich people hold office, and therefore we need pay raises. Low pay means that regular Americans can't afford the job of being a politician. Now that's the argument that I often hear and that I think is really interesting. When I started this project, I had two big concerns with that argument. The first is that the people who promote that sort of line of reasoning never present any actual evidence to support it. They don't point to studies that look across states. They don't point to studies that look across nations or across counties, city governments. As far as I know, prior to my research, there was never a study that took that claim seriously and really investigated, okay, well, if we did bump up the pay for our politicians, would we get a more economically diverse mix of people holding office? And I'm a political scientist, so when I hear a claim, even a claim that kind of makes sense, it seems like common sense, if the person making that claim doesn't have some evidence to back it up, my antennas kind of go up and I start thinking a little bit harder about it, because I think, if you're right, there would be some evidence there. You'd be able to show me something. The other reason why I was initially skeptical, once my antennas were up, I started thinking about it. And here's the problem as I see it. So let's say the North Carolina General Assembly pays $13,000 a year. That's not a lot of money on the one hand, but to get there, you have to run a campaign. That campaign can take you 6 months, and it can also take a lot of your time and energy. It'll cause you to forego income, devoting your time to the campaign rather than to something that would have been financially productive for you. And when you're doing that campaigning work, your salary is $0. There is no salary. North Carolina General Assembly will pay you if you get in, but they won't pay you while you're running. No state does that, as far as I know. Correct me if I'm wrong, but nobody pays candidates. I can't imagine the Facebook comments we would get on that one. And so if I'm someone who can't afford to take 6 months off work to run for the General Assembly, if I can't afford to do that for $0 because it would ruin my family, then it doesn't really matter if you offer me $50,000 if I win or $100,000 if I win. My answer is still going to be I can't afford to take that time off to run in the first place. Moreover, and this is where the field of labor economics becomes sort of relevant, there's a lot of research outside of the political advocacy world that actually says if you start paying politicians more, you're going to get more affluent professionals running for political office. Because guess what? That pay raise doesn't just go to the lower income candidates, it goes to everybody. And so all of a sudden, if you're paying $100,000 and I make $100,000, all of a sudden it's an easy trade. Before, at $13,000, I couldn't justify that lost income. So it's possible that pay raises won't help the people who are left out of the political process as is. It might actually make holding political office more attractive to the kinds of people who already run. To put it another way, if you told me, Nick, and you should call me Nick, said, Nick, I'll give you $100 if you win the City of Oaks Marathon. I would tell you, you can't really see me because I'm behind a podium, but if you could, it would be obvious that I am not an elite marathon runner. And I would say there's no way I could win the City of Oaks Marathon. I just couldn't do it. It would take me, 100,000 hours of training, and I'm not going to do it. I can't take time off work. I'm not going to do that. Well, then you said, okay, how about this, Nick? I'll sweeten the deal. I'll offer you 10 grand if you win the City of Oaks Marathon. I'd say same answer. I'm still not going to run that race and win. And I know that going in, and so I'm not even going to bother trying. But if you did put that $10,000 prize on there, a lot more elite runners would probably show up on race day, which would make my chances even worse. And that's, I think, the problem with the logic that pay raises for winning an election necessarily mean that more economically disadvantaged people are going to do that. So what do the actual data say? I'm a quantitative political scientist. What I want to see are data. I don't want to see cherry-picked anecdotes. I don't want to hear stories. I want you to show me some representative systematic data when you make a claim about a reform or a policy intervention. And the National Conference of State Legislators, the one who, the organization that writes about this pay problem, they also collect really terrific data on state lawmakers. And so just as an aside, if you're ever doing research on state lawmakers, this is usually where I start out. They have demographic data, historical information. They track issues across states. They have new bills. They're a terrific resource. And one of the things they have is data on the economic backgrounds, the occupations of the people who hold office in all 50 states. Now, they don't have it for every year. They started doing it in 1993. They collected every state, the percentage of people in that state's legislature who were attorneys, and the percentage of people who were business owners, and the percentage of people who worked in insurance, and the percentage of people and on down, including the percentage of people who do manual labor, service industry, clerical jobs, what I would call your working class people. They did that in 1993, and they did it in 1995. Then, and no one can tell me why, they stopped until 2007, and they started back up. Don't know why, what the break was about. And before they did it, they actually took their technique of categorizing occupations from an organization called the Insurance Information Institute, which is a national organization that represents insurance industry. And they've actually been doing this since the 1960s, but they don't normally share their data except for 1 year. In 1979, they put all their data on the occupational backgrounds of politicians together. They released it kind of like a book or a report. And so what I did is I took their 1979 data, the National Conference of State Legislatures 93, 95, and 2007 data, and I just asked, is it really true that working class people are more likely to hold office in states that pay more? So we've got data from the 70s, from the 90s, from more recently. What does it actually say? And you can plot it. You can just take a 30,000 feet view. So I'm going to put here on the horizontal axis, this is how much the state paid at that time in their base salary for legislators in 2007 dollars. So I'm going to adjust all the states for inflation. And I'm going to put on the vertical axis the percentage of your state legislature that comes from working class jobs. These jobs actually make up a majority of the labor force: manual labor, service industry, and clerical. They tend to be on the low end of the income distribution. And I think if you want to talk about economic diversity of your political institutions, you want to affect this group. You want to say that I'm getting more people who do these kinds of jobs in the political office. And if you just look at the data, there's no real relationship there. And if there is, it's actually negative. States historically in the US that pay more don't have more working class people in their legislatures, according to these two, I think, highly credible data sets. If anything, they seem to have slightly fewer. And we can torture the data a little bit more. That's my job. And I can tell you that if I just analyze each year separately, so just break out 1979, there's that same little downward slope just in 1979 and 93 and 2007. This isn't some fluke of the particular years, and I'm just combining them in some funny way. I can do sort of a more complex statistical model where I control for how demanding holding office is, and we measure that with how long the session is, and how big the typical legislator's staff is, how professionalized the legislature is. And all these context variables I can control for per capita personal income in the state, the poverty rate, the inequality rate, Republican vote share, term limits, anything I can think of that might somehow be affecting the share of legislators from the working class. I can also take into account, I said that mileage reimbursement and per diems for food and lodging were important. I can take that into account too, and if I just look at those, same basic story. States that pay more to their politicians don't seem to have a more kind of economically diverse, don't seem to have more regular citizens going on to become politicians. Just to put this in black and white, if you were to pay an extra $100,000 to your state legislature, you would lose between 4 and 5 percentage points in the share of working class people in that legislature. So just the opposite of what the reform narrative says. Now, you could come back to me and say, well, Nick, that's who holds office. Maybe working class people, they run at greater rates with the promise of a higher salary, and they just lose. I tested that hypothesis too. So in 2012, I actually collaborated with researchers at Berkeley, Michigan, and Sewanee, which is in Tennessee. And we ran a national survey of everyone running for state legislature nationwide. Not just the people who won, but all the candidates. And I think that's really important. And separate from this talk, I just want to say, I think that's a group we don't pay enough attention to. Candidates. We know a lot about elected officials. We know a lot about regular citizens. But I really think that we need to pay more attention, not just to who's winning, but who's running. Especially, and this is maybe just a critique of the political science literature on this topic, but we wanted to contribute something, so we ran what was at the time the only confidential, nonpartisan, non-issue driven survey of state legislative candidates in all 50 states. We sent out 10,000 letters. We also sent out 10,000 emails, whatever medium was comfortable to the legislator or the candidate. And we asked them questions. There were a few about their issue positions, but other groups, bothered them about their issue positions. We really wanted to know what is it like to be a candidate? What makes it easy? What makes it hard? Because at the end of the day, one of my bigger interests is just how do you get more good people to run for political office? That's a much bigger question than I have time for today. But the first step is just understanding the experience of the people who do run, I think. And one of the things we could do with this survey is we can see not just who's winning, but who's running. And does that look different? And so here, I've just plotted the legislative salary in 2007 dollars again, this time against the proportion of candidates, not winners, but just candidates from the working class.
The survey was just of state legislative candidates?
All 10,000 people who ran in 2012, who were declared candidates as of August.
But just for state legislators?
We actually tried other types of candidates too. The response rates, you survey gubernatorial candidates, you are not going to get a response back. They're different. The constraints on their time are even worse than those of state leg candidates. But I did not find any real difference in the percentage of candidates from the working class in the states that pay the least, they're on the left, or in the states that pay the most. It's not that workers are running and losing. They're still not running, even when you offer a high salary. Now you may say, well, why is that? Why is the salary not working? And this survey lets me directly test that hunch that maybe the bigger prizes are bringing out more of the elite runners. So one of the questions we asked in the survey, one of the sets of questions we asked these candidates about thinking back to the first time they ran for political office. What were they seriously concerned about? And we gave them lots of options. We let them write in, and we learned a lot. I mean, this is just a fascinating question. You ask people, the first time you ran, what made it really unpleasant for you? But among those, we had things like the need to raise a lot of money, the privacy of my family, losing out on income while campaigning, and losing out on income while serving in office. And this is the really interesting thing. If I just isolate those white-collar professionals, these are the people who already hold office most of the time. These are your people who run marathons. These are your people who are normally there at every race. If you look at them, if you look at states that pay more and less, and you ask, well, what percentage of the white-collar professionals in those states were worried about losing the race? That's one of their options. They said, the first time I ran, I was really worried about losing the election, something totally unrelated. It's about 20%, regardless of whether the state pays a lot or a little to its legislators. About 1 in 5 candidates, when they first ran, they felt kind of shaky. If you ask them, how many of you are worried about raising money and all the burdens of fundraising? About 60%, regardless of how much you pay, say, I was really worried that first time I ran about fundraising. The gap between these two graphs, I think, is telling in and of itself. Candidates dislike fundraising more than they worry about actually winning the race. That's probably something by itself. But the one thing that really differed in states that pay more was that white-collar professionals, people who are already earning high incomes, said that when the state pays more, they worry less about losing income while holding office, which is exactly what the labor economics theory would say. It would say that when you pay more, you not only make the prize bigger for people who don't earn a lot, you make the opportunity cost lower for people who already do earn a lot. And more of them run, and they're already running and winning, and so you aren't going to see any big demographic change. And that's exactly what I saw in this survey of actual candidates. Now, I had a student of mine, a master's student, who got interested in this topic, and she said, what about other demographic groups? You know, maybe diversity means more than a person's economic background. Maybe it means other things. And so she went through and looked at other kinds of diversity that we might care about. So this is my student, Katherine Tamer, who just finished a master's project, a thesis at the Public Policy School, about whether increasing compensation promotes more diverse political institutions. And she looked at things like the gender makeup of the state legislature. We actually have a lot more data on the gender backgrounds of politicians. That's something that's easier to collect. And it's something that the organizations like the NCSL have collected more often. And she finds no difference in the gender makeup. States that pay more, they pay less. The percentage of the legislature that's female is about the same. She didn't find any sort of meaningful differences when she looked at the percentage of the legislature that was Latino or African American. The one place she found big differences, and this is, I think, just fascinating, is the age. The average age of the state legislature was lower, younger, in states that paid more. And people like this. They like this graphic because they say, oh, yeah, if you pay more, you get more millennials to run, more of those young people who are still, you know, in the kind of in their 20s and 30s, they're going to throw their hats in the ring. But what she did, and it was very smart, is she actually broke that down by the ages of the people. And she said, what if we just look at people ages 18 to 34? And in states that pay more, they're still running at, or they're still holding office at just a tiny rate. The young people don't hold office in big numbers anywhere, whether you pay a lot or a little. The real shift is in the people in sort of the income earning years of 35 to 50. And they are much more likely to hold office in states that pay more. And they're just taking seats away from people who are retired, basically. So it's not that the salary we pay is totally irrelevant to who holds office, but all of this is very, very different from the kinds of claims you're going to hear from proponents of pay raises who say that if we pay more, everyone, rich and poor, is going to be represented in our political institutions. The data just, don't really support that theory. Now, I don't want to misrepresent the research on other issues, so I will just point out to you, and I'm going to put at the bottom of the screen the relevant citations so people watching at home can go back and read the whole studies if they want. But it is the case that when politicians' salaries are higher, members are less likely to have some outside job. Every additional $10,000 in salary is associated with about a 5 percentage point reduction in the share of your legislature that works another job in addition to being a lawmaker. Every doubling in salary, so we go from $13,000 to $26,000, we would expect about a 22% reduction in missed votes, people who just don't show up when the legislature calls a roll call. We know that there was this really interesting study of governors where they showed that governors in the top half of the gubernatorial income distribution were about 2 percentage points more in line with their constituents than governors in the bottom half. And that we know that politicians who are paid more spend more time directly contacting constituents and dealing with their needs. And so it does look like salaries change the job of being a politician, but they don't change, interestingly, fiscal discipline in the state. So one really neat study looked at whether states that pay higher salaries, whether, if I'm getting a higher salary, am I then just spending money all over the place? And that doesn't seem to be the case. Fiscal discipline, by which I mean spending per capita and taxes per capita, is about the same in states with higher and lower salaries. But there isn't more economic diversity in states that pay politicians more. So what does this all mean? What's the bottom line here? That's what I'm always interested in. I think it goes something like this. If I were talking to a proponent of pay raises for politicians, I would say there is some evidence that's on your side. Politicians who are paid better look better in some ways. But you don't want your sales pitch to really be about diversity. The facts aren't on your side, and if you go out and make some claim like that, some obnoxious political scientist is going to write in and say that you're factually wrong. To the extent there's a case for higher pay for politicians, it has more to do with government quality, how much of their personal effort they devote to the job, not the sort of mix of who holds office. I would also say, and this is more of an editorial, if you're somebody who cares about diversity, I would throw it right back on the organization and say, if you really care about diversity, if that's really your goal, find something else. Pay raises aren't going to do it, and you need to look beyond that particular institutional tool. And if you really think that pay is important for politicians, please relieve them of the burden of setting it themselves by finding some way to set it in a fair way, and we can talk about what that might mean, and then making it automatically increase over time. Don't make them go back to the well and set their own salaries time and time again, because they pay for it. I think if I were to leave you with any message, it would be this. Legislative pay is important. It affects all of our pocketbooks, and it might affect the kind of government that we get, or the quality government we get. But the politicians who work on it always get beat up for doing so. And so what I did, this is true, last Friday, as I was preparing these slides, I thought, put your money where your mouth is, Nick. So I actually called Representative Hurley's office. She's only there Monday through Thursday, so I had to leave a voicemail. And I just thanked her. I said, I'm a political scientist at Duke. I'm not one of your constituents. I'm not a donor or anything. But I recognize how thorny this issue is and how hard it is for any politician to do any kind of work, to say anything on this issue. And I do think that we need to be kinder to the politicians who are working on this, because the proposals that they make don't look like power grabs. They don't look like they're trying to just enlarge their portfolios in some significant way. They also don't seem to do much for diversity, but it does seem like what politicians are trying to do when they propose raising their salaries is just make it so that they can focus exclusively on the job of governing and representing their constituents. But they always pay for it politically. So I'll stop there. I'm happy to talk more about this, and I want to thank the John Locke Foundation again for having me out.